はい、皆さん、こんにちは。
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending the JIIA Security webinar sponsored by the Japan Institute of International Affairs. My name is Iida. I'll be serving as your MC today. Today, regarding economic security, we have a wonderful guest speaker from Georgetown University, Professor Abraham Newman. And we have asked him to present today. And as a commentator, we have Mr. Satoshi Inomata of the IDE-JETRO. So let me share with you a few housekeeping matters in Japanese, and then I'll switch to English. First of all, questions from the audience can be posted using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if you want to address your question to a specific person, then please do make that clear in your question at the outset. Also, please be concise and to the point in describing your question, and we can entertain or receive questions from the beginning of the presentation. And we have also received some questions prior to the webinar. We may not be able to cover all questions due to the interest of time today, so I do ask for your kind understanding. And the video footage of this proceeding will be edited and will be made available by the JIIA, made public. And therefore, please do not take audio or visual recordings of the proceedings of today's webinar on your part. Now then, without further ado, let us start. So now I'll switch to English.
We are very fortunate to have Professor Abraham Newman from Georgetown University today to talk about economic security based on his recent book with Professor Henry Farrell. And we are very much excited to hear what you have to say. We decided to have this conversation because the Japanese version of your book just came out, and I think Japanese people will be very interested in what you have to say. So the floor is yours, and please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Iida. This is really a great honor for both me and Henry, my co-author, Henry Farrell, who's at SAIS. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion because in many places, we know that Japan has been thinking about these issues in a very deep way for even longer than people in the United States. So let me, I'm going to share my, confirm your speaking language. Never done that before, but I think that's fun. I am going to share my slides and start the presentation. So this book, it really starts with the question of how have global networks transformed global politics. And we know that whether it is financial transactions, information, or production, they have created these global networks in a very quick period of time. It's hard to remember, but up through the 1970s, we still had capital controls. Things like the global internet really since the 2000s, and production was still national largely through the 1990s. And so these networks that bind the world together are still pretty new, and we haven't fully thought about their implications. There's a standard story, which most people are familiar with. Thomas Friedman is the caricature. he had that book that he wrote, The World is Flat, which somewhere in your brain, you probably know the story. But this piece that he wrote in 1999, I think is even more on point, where he said, we're now in a world that's not about a wall, but a web. And he was really focusing on the end of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall. And his argument was that new technology was going to sideline great power conflict, and that these new technological systems, these networks, were going to, like the World Wide Web, we still thought that was a new thing then, the World Wide Web, that they were going to put companies in charge, they were going to decenter power, and that they were going to build peace and prosperity through economic exchange. And we know now from what has been happening over the last several years that that's not what is happening. So many people like to blame the man in the top corner, but obviously this is not just something that is about Donald Trump. The Biden administration has continued to use these tools as it has tried to confront Russia in its attack on Ukraine. Similarly, the US has used many of these tools under the Biden administration to constrain China in the realm of technology. And we also see that these tools are not just used by the United States and China as then they interact, but also Japan, other countries have used these economic networks in order to put pressure on other countries. And so what is happening? And here, our argument is pretty simple. It has two main moves. The first is this banal map, this map that, if you ever flew to the United States on Delta or Air France, you ended up in Atlanta. And that's really nice if you want to taste a million types of Coca-Cola. But otherwise, if you're going from, let's say, Cancun to Caracas, why would you fly through Atlanta? And this is a reality of the global economy, is that large companies often centralize their economic networks in order to manage the complexity that is globalization. And so if you look into your pocket, you have a phone, it's probably run either by Apple or Google in terms of the operating system. It runs on a chip that is made either by Samsung or TSMC. And if you make a financial transaction, it is going through about a host of 10 banks in the globe that process global financial transactions, a company like JP Morgan, for example. And so the fundamental picture, that image that Thomas Friedman gave us, the one that the world is flat, is in reality is not true. That in many places, the world is very centralized. And that centralization has an important implication for politics. And in our story, it's about the predators that sit at the center of these webs. Because in reality, webs, they don't decenter power. They bring resources to the center of the web. And in that center is the predator. And in our story, that is the states, whether it's the United States, China, the European Union, Japan, are using these networks of economic networks in order to either exclude actors from these resources, to cut them out of the web, or to use the web as a surveillance device, as a way to monitor and to understand what their adversaries are doing. And so it's really, our argument is very simple. It makes just these two basic moves. First, that the core networks of globalization are often centralized, and that states like the United States can use that structure of globalization to coerce their adversaries, either by cutting them out of the web or to monitor and surveil them. Okay, so now in the next part of the talk, I want to kind of talk about where this came from. I want to kind of give a warning about how this could get out of control, and then think about how do we protect globalization so that we can keep the most beneficial parts of globalization and only focus our economic security lens on the places that are the most dangerous. So what happened? And in our story, it's like any good comic book. There's always an origin story, a place where the superhero gets their powers. And often those origin stories start in tragedy. Something terrible happens, and they have to find this new power. And in our story, of course, it's the attacks of September 11th, 2001, where globalization, these networks are used against the United States. Terrorist networks use financial networks, communication networks, travel networks in order to attack the homeland. And agencies across the US, they are scrambling to figure out how to respond to this new challenge. And it's in our story, it's not some grand plan that the United States had to use these networks, but it's really in the fog of war, it discovers these maps, these networks that exist. And we tell the story in the book about the Snowden revelations and the kind of the way fiber optic cables were laid out and how the NSA used those structures to target the communications of terrorists. But then over time, so this is the actual the map from the Snowden revelations, and what you see is that these fiber optic cables, they go through these 7 access points, and because fiber optic cables communicate at the speed of light, sometimes it's faster for a country like Brazil to route its data through the United States rather than route it domestically. There's something funny about the NSA agent who wrote this map because they really like to ski. You can see they named all of these access points over these resorts. But for us, what's important is just, again, this idea that something that's supposed to be so decentralized, the internet, it converges again under these central points, and that creates opportunities for the states. In the book, we talk about how these things that at one point were seen as really extreme actions, things like cutting Iranian banks out of the SWIFT system. There was a moment where that seemed like a radical proposal. But when we got to the Russia sanctions, that we quickly blew past that kind of action. The current Russia sanctions, they have frozen Russian central bank assets, which, the SWIFT system, it's just like an email network. It's not actually where the money sits. So, to think about freezing people's central bank assets and then potentially taking that money and giving it to Ukraine, it's a far, these, in this incremental interventions, we have quickly escalated the types of tools we can use. And I'm just gonna kind of, in the next part of the talk about how this has both had very dramatic consequences, but can also potentially have unanticipated effects. Some, miscalculation can happen as well, and potentially escalation. So in the book, we talk about 3 different relationships. The first is the US-China relationship. And here we focus on the 5G battle, the role that the US has played to try to constrain Huawei, the maker, the Chinese company that makes these 5G systems. And here, the concern that the US government has is that Huawei could create an infrastructure that would give the Chinese government access to very vital information about what is happening amongst the United States and its allies. And so over many years, the United States has attempted to degrade Huawei's capability in this infrastructure. And here, what I want to show you is 2 different ways that the US has done that. The interesting thing is the US doesn't have a company which competes in this sector. The only really major competitor to Huawei is Ericsson or Nokia. And so the United States, even though they don't have a choke point, a key player in this network, they use other economic networks to degrade Huawei. And so on the top corner, you see the COO of Huawei, Meng. She's the daughter of the founder of Huawei. And she was arrested in Canada on her way from China to Mexico. She routed through Vancouver, where she owned several houses. And what happened is really interesting because the US government used the financial networks and the key nodes in those networks in order to put pressure on her. And so in particular, Huawei uses the bank HSBC, and HSBC, for totally different reasons, had run afoul of US sanctions law. It had signed a deferred prosecution agreement with the US government, which meant it had to report illicit activity to the US government. And it starts to report these suspicions about Huawei. And then the United States government uses its mutual legal assistance treaties with Canada to get her arrested and then potentially extradited. Ultimately, Meng goes back to China after she admits that the company has done some, breached some of these rules. She doesn't end up paying any kind of large fine, but the damage has already been done. She was in house arrest for multiple years. In the bottom corner, it's a graphic. You don't need to read it very closely, but it's another network that the United States used to constrain Huawei, and this was IP, intellectual property. And basically, what the United States has done is they've taken export controls and they have said it's not just American companies that cannot sell products to Huawei, but any company that uses American inputs and intellectual property, they cannot sell their products to Huawei. And because TSMC uses a whole host of American intellectual property in its semiconductor chips, it ultimately puts pressure on TSMC to stop exporting to Huawei. And this is called the foreign direct product rule. And so what I want you to see is that the US, even though it doesn't have a competitor, it can use both economic and intellectual property networks in order to put pressure on this company. For each of these examples, I'm going to show you an unanticipated consequence or a problem. And here is the question about fragmentation or evasion. And in one corner, you see kind of a mocking internet meme that was posted when Secretary Raimondo visited China in the fall. So she visited in the fall, and when she arrived, Huawei announced that they had a phone that evaded US export controls. And of course, she's proudly holding the phone, but this is all, a mock to make fun of her. But we can talk at length about whether these export controls worked or not, but either way, they are encouraging China to develop its own technology in this space because they've been cut off. In the bottom corner, I want to just flag about the way these economic sanctions incentivize countries to use alternatives to the US dollar. So this is a story about China and Russia trading in yuan. Henry and I do not think that the dollar will disappear as the global reserve currency, but you see these dark spaces happening, these places in the global economy where countries are using other means of exchange, and those are places where it's harder to monitor what they're being used for. And the problem is you could get dark spaces where rogue actors could use these spaces to do illicit activity. Okay, in addition to the adversaries with China, we talk about allies and what has happened as the US has used these tools with allies. This is a quote from the European Commissioner Vestager, where she says, "We have had a hard awakening into the era of weaponized interdependence." And Henry and we wrote an article that was called Weaponized Interdependence, and many of the theories that we used in that article are now in the book. And this is, it's for Europe, and I think for Japan and many other countries, the use of global networks as a tool of coercion, it upends the way foreign policy had been written for them, especially Europe, because their founding treaty, the Treaty of Rome, is all about openness. It's about liberalization will bring prosperity and peace. And so the idea that these networks could lead to coercion is quite threatening. And in particular, they're threatening for European firms. So there was a very revealing scandal in Sweden where the CEO of Ericsson, who makes the main competitor product to Huawei, his text messages were made public to a Swedish minister, where he's basically yelling at her to not ban Huawei from the Swedish market. And Sweden is under pressure from the United States to exclude Huawei from its systems. But the CEO of Ericsson is saying, if Sweden bans Huawei from Sweden, then China will ban Ericsson from China. And for Ericsson, China is a much bigger market than Sweden. And so these companies like Ericsson, Deutsche Bank, they're the ones that are under the gun of these types of economic moves from China or from the United States. And so they're often trying to figure out what to do. But I also want to say that Europe is also increasingly an actor in economic security. And this is the unanticipated consequence, is that the US in many ways pushed Europe to start using these tools. And we see that in the Russia sanctions campaign, where the ECB, they were the main actor in freezing Russian central bank reserves. And so if you're in Beijing, Europe can no longer say like, oh, this is just a fight between China and the US. Europe has shown that it has quite powerful tools in this domain. The third set of relationships that we talk about are the intermediaries. They're the companies that are carrying out a lot of these means of economic coercion. And we kind of tease out different strategies that firms try to pursue. So TSMC, for example, they tried to be neutral for a very long time and say they weren't going to pick sides or be part of any of this conflict. But then you get this very, I think, embarrassing and a little bit revealing post that TSMC has on LinkedIn, where they say, we're searching for somebody with geoeconomic experience. And this was about 2 years ago. And, in many ways, this was several years too late. This is TSMC is in the middle of this large conflict between states. Microsoft is a counterexample where they, for a long time, attempted to be neutral. But then during the Ukraine war, they really come to the side of the Western states, the allies, and they have a remarkable effort to lift the Ukrainian government into the cloud right as the Russian invasion happens in order to save the government ministries. And it's a clear example of companies choosing that that they have an interest in being on one side and not the other. The final strategy is to try to, I would say, almost be a pirate to evade this whole conversation. And in the book, we talk about crypto and the efforts of crypto regimes to be beyond governments. But if you look at the story of Binance, the market, which is it's a crypto market for the exchange of different cryptocurrencies, ultimately, people want to make money. And in order to make money, they have to centralize exchange. And that's what Binance is. It's a central exchange for this decentralized asset. And then the US government went after Binance, and it wound up facing a very large fine. But more importantly, it signed a deferred prosecution agreement, which requires Binance to basically be the eyes and ears of the US government for illicit activity that's happening in crypto. And so we think this is a very difficult strategy. Okay, in just the last few minutes, I want to kind of talk about how do we avoid escalation. This is a really interesting book, The Economic Weapon by Nicholas Mulder, where he warns that if we cut people off from the global economy, that they could resort to military means, not just economic means, as a response. And he shows this in the run-up to World War II, that this, as US and Western sanctions were applied, particularly to Japan, it forced Japan into a more militarized stance than perhaps they otherwise would have. And so how do we avoid this worst outcome? And that's where I think it's about building the institutions, an economic security state that can deal with these problems. And here the first issue is just that we lack, in many cases, the expertise. In my university, we are tasked with training international relations experts, but security and economic issues are still siloed from each other. It is very rare that students are trained in both things together. And that's, in this new world, economic relations are security relations, and we have to train students in this way. And government agencies, they also have to train their employees to think about these things in an interacting way. The second is to build the right institutions that bring people together to think about these in government. And of course, the Japanese, you're much more advanced in these issues because you've already created, a cabinet position and a law that kind of thinks about how you would have economic security in the government. But I still think here there's more to think about of how the government could interact with industry, for example, on an ongoing basis to respond when coercion is presented. So that how could the government, MITI and the Keiretsu system work together in order to help each other when there is a coercive moment. The third point is that this is a set of new weapons, and we don't really have the norms, the principles, and the rules of the road of how to prevent their use in an escalatory way. And I liken this to the period after nuclear weapons were created. Nuclear weapons didn't come with a rule book. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, it makes it very clear, that people are stumbling through. They don't know how these weapons should or shouldn't be used. And so one of the things I think is really important is that we come up with a new language that talks about what is appropriate use, what is a proportional response, what's an appropriate target. These are all things that need to be defined in this new era. And the last point that I will make is that all of these tools are sticks. They are coercive punishments to get people to do what we want. And if we want to use them in a productive way, we have to pair them with incentives, with carrots that get them to do the things that we want. And here I bring up the example of climate change and the European Union. They've been doing a lot of things. They have a new directive to limit commodities that are produced from deforestation. And if they're creating basically tariffs and sanctions for those products. And if you're a country like Indonesia, you see this as a threat to your livelihood. And so, even though Europe might see this as a worthwhile endeavor, that in order for us to get the US, Europe, the West, to get people to do these green incentives, we have to pair these sticks with carrots. And that's true in the case of the Russia sanctions as well, or in human rights, or in non-proliferation. There's a whole host of areas where we've used these economic weapons. But if we really want people to, over the long term, get on board with these policies, we have to convince those countries that there's something in it for them. So just to conclude, our main points are first, that these economic networks of globalization, they're not just about prosperity and the creation of wealth. They're also sites of control. That policymakers, they need a strategic understanding of both the benefits and drawbacks of using them. And we need action in order to avoid unnecessary economic damage. This includes having a new language, new institutions, and new strategies. Otherwise, the very best parts of globalization could be at risk. And with that, I want to just thank you again for listening, and I'm excited to hear your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So that was wonderful. And so we have a commentator who will say a few comments on your presentation and also adds his own point of view. So Dr. Inomata, please go ahead.
Let me share the slide. Oops, sorry. Is it working? Sorry,
Hi, 大丈夫です。
Yes, we see the slides.
Somehow I cannot see myself. Sorry. Here I go. Okay. Right. Okay. It's my great honor to be a discussant of this very interesting seminar. Professor Newman's earlier paper, Weaponized Interdependence, How Global Economic Networks Shape State Coercion, has significantly impacted my recent research, which I shall present in the next 10 minutes. So I hope it has some relevancy and complementarity to Professor Newman's talk. Now, basically, I introduce a risk indicator for firms' business operation, especially in the global context, by mapping the degree of supply chain exposure to network concentration risk. In the perspective of risk analysis, there are a volume dimension and a frequency dimension for risk assessment. For example, the chances that our families get infected with virus will be high, either because they go to a risky place together, or even just one of them goes, the person visits there frequently. Now, this is taken from the OECD's portal on risk assessment tools. The horizontal axis shows impact, while the vertical axis is likelihood. Well, the nuance is a bit different, yet still, I believe that this is more or less in line with the volume frequency dichotomy. Now, paraphrasing it into a context, a supply chain is considered highly exposed to a specific country risk if its product contains a significant volume of value added sourced from the country in question, or if the production activities along the supply chain involves frequent engagement with the country's industry sectors. In what follows, the former is measured by a trade in value-added indicators, while the latter is captured by pass-through frequency indicators. They are both derived from the inter-country input tables, which is a common device to show the structure of global production networks. By combining these two indicators, it is possible to present supply chain exposure to concentration risk in both volume and frequency dimensions. So let us start with the concentration risk in terms of volume. Now, trading value added, or TIVA for short, considers each country's contribution to value-adding processes of a given commodity. Therefore, from the perspective of the final producers, TIVA indicator presents how much value of their product is attributable to the value-added origin of which country, showing the ultimate form of supply chain dependence in volume terms. Next, we shall consider network concentration in terms of frequency. In the viewpoint of risk analysis, if a supply chain has the number of production paths that go through the industries of high-risk countries, whatever the definition is, then its vulnerability is considered higher. Pass-through frequency, or PTF, is defined as the average number of times that the supplier of analytical concern emerges along the production path. And effectively, in a context, it measures the frequency that a supply chain passes through the industrial sectors of a high-risk country. In this case, country C. The conventional analysis of geographic concentration are largely based on the volume concept, such as the Herfindahl-Hirschman index or a locational Gini coefficient, while the PTF model explores a novel dimension of frequency in this analytical space. So why does frequency matter? Here I want to refer to one particular example of high policy relevance in the geoeconomic context. Let us consider the export control measures by the United States on advanced technologies and strategic materials. One of their policies characteristics is in the extensive implementation of extraterritorial application of the US rule, which has been mentioned by the Professor Newman's talk as well, where a foreign establishment, whether US or non-US, must obtain a license from the relevant US authorities when trading a controlled item with the countries of the US security concern. In general, the license is required for every transaction planned, irrespective of its volume. Of course, with some exception of extremely small values. So hence, from the perspective of the lead firm of global supply chain, it is the engagement frequency with the country of concern of its own as well as upstream suppliers that matters for supply chain management. Well, not to mention the time foregone and the administrative cost incurred during the review process by the US authority, the firm may have to revise the entire production plan if the license is not granted. The frequency indicator can address this kind of risk, which is particularly evident in the industries such as ICT equipment sector, because it has extremely complex nexus of cross-border transactions, even though the volume of each batch may be quite small. Here I represent some analytical example using these two indicators, and this is my final slide. Now, this figure shows the relative risk positions concerning all supply chains of the United States, shown by blue dots, and China by red dots, mutually targeting the other as a high-risk country. The horizontal axis gives the share of value added sourced from the other country, while the vertical axis is the industry's total PTF for all branches of its supply chain. So therefore, the horizontal axis is the concentration in volume, and the vertical axis is concentration in frequency. Now, the supply chain is considered more exposed to the concentration risk in the other country if markers are located towards the top right corner. Now, the figure shows the dramatic development of the US-China bilateral production structure from 1995 to 2018. The United States became far more dependent on China during this period than the other way around. In 1995, the network concentration of the US supply chain vis-a-vis China was only visible in the textile and leather product sector. By 2018, the US supply chain of every industry had significantly increased its concentration in China, both in terms of volume and pass-through frequencies. Now, these changes are particularly evident in key manufacturing sector of national importance, such as ICT equipment and automotive. Among the service sectors, telecommunications is highly dependent on China's domestic production networks. Now, the US supply chain of the ICT product here presents an interesting case. which is positioned in the top left corner of the diagram. The low concentration of its value-added origin in China may be just a straightforward reflection of the sheer size of the US economy. By contrast, the high positioning along the vertical axis indicate that the frequent exposure of its supply chain to the production networks within China's geographic territory, raising the likelihood of getting caught by any contingencies in the country. In general, the two metrics of geographic concentration in volume term and frequency term seems to be positively correlated. However, the aforementioned case of the US ICT sector suggests that only looking at the volume side may lead to significant underestimation of the overall risk in supply chain management. But thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. So before moving into the Q&A session, Professor Newman, do you have a few words to say on Dr. Inomata's presentation?
Yes. So first of all, I want to say, Dr. Inomata, that is so fascinating and so important. Because I think everybody needs to think about the risk, doing risk assessments that help us identify which are the really important places to focus the attention, because it's very easy to just say everything's a problem, and then we end up just, closing our entire economies, I think. So, really focusing on where do we need to diversify our sourcing, and it looks like this, your assessment tool would be a really powerful way to start thinking about those issues. One of the things that there's an interesting paper from a research group in Australia where what they add to this kind of a question is to look at the alternative markets for certain of these choke points. And so there are certain places where a substitute is readily available or would not be difficult to find. And so trying to then add that as another level would be very interesting, because there are certain cases where there's a dependence on a product, but that dependence is not actually, if coercion was used, it would not be a very strategic, effective use of coercion, because the companies could shift to other suppliers. But in some cases, there isn't. And so, adding, in addition to the value added and pass-through measures, then kind of looking at the concentration of the global market to think about, is there, and that goes back to kind of like the critical minerals story, where there isn't anybody else that processes the minerals, even if you could get the minerals from somebody else. And so anyway, but I think it looks really promising, and I really am excited to see more of your work on that.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll ask you a couple questions, and there are a lot of questions. So if you cannot answer all of them, that's fine, but you can just pick and choose. Let's start with a few sort of fundamental questions. First, and I think you touched upon some, but the question is, what are the major challenges for the US to pursue its economic statecraft? The second question is, if Japan were to weaponize interdependence, is it possible in the future? And third question is, economic statecraft is, especially US economic statecraft, is based on its technological advantages So, what are the ways in which we could maintain those technological advantages compared to our opponents? So again, some are tough, some are easy, but you can go ahead. You're muted.
Thank you. So I think the main point of our book is to really say we can't put these tools back in the bottle. The genie is out of the bottle. It's like what we need to do is to use them responsibly. And there are many places where these tools are very important and they're being used in an important way. I personally think that the sanctions against Russia are legitimate and that they are necessary and that they're an important part of our defense of and assistance to Ukraine. But my concern is that if we just use them in an ad hoc way without a strategy, that they will lose their legitimacy and that also that they could have unanticipated consequences. And so I think the biggest challenge for the US to pursue its economic statecraft is really to embed it in a strategic agenda that has a more thought out of when we can and when we can't use them. Japan has, it has weaponized interdependence already. I put up a little picture, but it was a case with Korea where there was a court case about reparations between the Korean court levied against Japan, and in response, the Japanese government threatened to limit the export of certain very important chemicals to the Korean semiconductor supply chain. And it's just it's another example of where it's not just the United States. Europe is using these tools too. China, of course, is using them as well. And so we need to not think of it just as an American issue, but in many places the US is at the center of more of these networks than other players. And maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next set of questions are slightly more complicated, but if I may. The United States is the originator of economic statecraft and economic coercion, and the other G7 countries are looking away. I'm not sure if that's correct, but so how long will this last? That's the question. And the next question is, what do you think are the next set of strategic materials after the controls over semiconductors? And the third is similar, but slightly different. Aside from US-China de-risking, how can foreign direct investment and trade be used as diplomatic tools? Okay, there's some more, but let me stop there, and if you can tackle some of these.
So I think that the US opened the box on these tools, but I think the G7 is not looking away, but I think is actively thinking about how to cooperate to use these tools, especially in the face of a Chinese aggression vis-a-vis using these tools. So in the G7 meeting that happened it was about a year ago in Japan, the Japanese government was instrumental in creating a coordination mechanism amongst the G7. I think part of that question was, is this sustainable, these tools? And I think that it's not a universal answer, that it differs by networks. So in the financial network, I think there's really no alternative to the US dollar in the foreseeable future. And this is in large part because of domestic conflicts in other societies. In Europe, Brexit really undermined the financial networks of Europe as playing an alternative. And in China, the Hong Kong crisis, both the democratic crackdown and the zero COVID policy really undermined Hong Kong as being a global financial alternative to New York. And so, you know, it's not just enough for countries to say we don't like the fact that the US has this power. There has to be a substitute. And in some places, that's just very difficult. In other places, like in telecommunications, Huawei still makes a cheaper, high quality product. And so it's more likely that that's a point of concern rather than finance. But I want to stress there's not one global network, but like I gave the example of the IP network and the financial network, they're all playing at the same time. In terms of the next strategic material, everybody can send me a few dollars, and I'll tell them what I think. No, I'm just kidding. I think the next strategic material is data. And that is what I think the current Biden administration's latest executive orders are focused on data. So connected cars, cloud computing, data brokers. And so I'm focusing my research right now on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we are currently receiving increasing number of questions from the floor. So again, because of the time limit, I'll just read the questions, and if you can answer, and if you just want to say, there's too much to tell, that's fine too. Okay, so let's start. First, the economist Baldwin says that the weaponized interdependence can lead to war. But if the probability of war is high, this can be a hedge to reduce the opponent's power. I'm not sure if Baldwin said that, but what do you think? Okay, so and the next question is, what do you think about small yard, high fence? Is it a good way to communicate to the adversary that there's a large area of common interest? The next question is sorry. We have already seen that sanctions do not necessarily bring the desired results. How else can we achieve the same results in the current world without economic sanctions, I guess? That's what she says. The last question is that if China were a democratic country, would the U.S. consider China as a threat, or the reaction of the U.S. against China be the same nevertheless? Very hypothetical question.
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead again. If you can just feel free to answer or not to answer.
Yes. So, Henry and I, we are in the view that economic coercion is not simply an alternative to war. I think there's a set of arguments that these tools prevent war because they give people an off-ramp. And that can happen. It can be a way to de-escalate conflict. But if you look at the war in Ukraine, the United States and Europe, we are sending arms as well as economic sanctions, that these things are going hand in hand. They're not seen as alternatives. And if you think about what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz, Iran through the Houthis are blowing up ships because they don't have an alternative, and so they are frustrated and they're using weapons. So I think we need to not just think that these are simply an alternative to war, but they can also be part of the battlefield. I think the small yard high fence has limits, but I think it's an important next step as opposed to what the Trump administration had been doing, because it is signaling to allies and adversaries that there are constraints on what the US is doing with this power. And if you don't start to think of ways to signal, then allies and adversaries will think that anything we do will get us in trouble. So then we might as well not listen to any of this. And so I think it's an important step. It doesn't solve all of this problem, but it is the exact kind of, when I was talking about rules of the road, we need to be moving in that direction. The question, do sanctions work, I think is very complicated. Foreign policy in general often does not achieve the complete objective that decision makers want it to achieve. We want peace, we want, that's very difficult. But the sanctions against Russia, for example, there's no question that they have increased the transaction costs to Russia of conducting its war. And if there were no sanctions, Russia would have a lot more money to buy and arm and attack Ukraine. And so I think they are working. They don't stop Putin. He has other objectives. The final part about China, if it was a democracy, I think that the US and many other countries, they thought that economic interdependence would transform China into a liberal country, and that would also transform its position vis-a-vis the world. And that hasn't happened. And so I think that really has snapped people into, to be more awake and aware of, we are going to trade with each other, but we're also going to be political rivals. And so that's, we need a new set of tools to think about how do we manage that relationship.
Okay, thank you very much. So these very insightful comments, and we have learned a lot. You talked about the need for education in your presentation, and I think in a very short period of time we did educate a large number of people.
So wonderful.
Yes.
I just want to thank you again for the invitation, and Dr. Inomata for the amazing research that he is doing, and all of the listeners. It's really a wonderful audience, and I look forward to engaging with you and other people in Japan more, because I think Japan has really thought about these questions in really deep and important ways, and I need to learn more too from you.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's keep in touch.
Sounds good.
Okay, so 皆様予定していた時刻になりましたので。
Since it's time, we would like to close the webinar. Thank you very much, and please be reminded to fill out the questionnaire, the survey, for our benefit, please. Now then,
Thank you very much, Dr. Newman, and thank you, Dr. Inomata, for wonderful contributions. And I'd like to thank the audience too for your participation.
Thank you again.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good
Bye.
day.
Thank you.
Thank you.